Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Colubrid and Colubroid Radio. This school year has started, so I've switched gears from field biologist to teacher slash professor slash field biologist. And as always, I have Matt. So how's it going, Matt?
Well, I switched gears to the food monkey that's just throwing rodents inside the little deli cups and feeding hatchling snakes and adult snakes.
Yes.
So
Matt's life has become deli cup, pinky, snake. Deli cup, pinky, snake. Deli cup, pinky, snake. How many Neos do you think you are currently feeding? I love these questions because it always makes you feel good about the fact that I don't have as much as you.
Well, I'll put it this way. I've shipped out over 600 snakes so far this year.
Holy mother of God.
Yeah. And I still have hatchlings hatching, and I still have eggs being laid, so it's still kind of a interesting year, if you will.
You're insane, man, in a good way. Thank you for providing us with all our baby snakes. I feel like you're like a one-man army. So
that's why you drink beers and clean snake cages.
Yeah. You called me last night to talk about the show tonight, and I believe you were cleaning cages then, and I'm pretty sure you were cleaning cages right before you came on today.
That's dead on.
Yeah. All right. Well, you got to be dedicated to the cause, and you certainly are. So today's guest is Dr. Jennifer Archer. Jen is well known, I would say, in the Florida king snake community, especially out of Florida. And I met Jen after I recorded, I think it was my first podcast I was ever on, from the ground up with Phelan. And I talked a little bit about crypto. And then Jen reached out, and we've been working together with snakes, colubrids, crypto. And I thought it'd be a great opportunity, since people are always asking me about crypto, if we had Jen on today to talk about crypto, how she finds it, the vectors, kind of our conversations. And then we thought, why not talk about one other parasite in particular, a roundworm called Strongyloides, which is very common in reptile collections. So today's episode is going to involve a little bit of Florida king snake talk, a lot of disease vector talk. It's more of a kind of a husbandry piece. I'm going to say this now. We're going to say it again. We're going to say it again after we say it again. None of us are veterinarians, so we're not taking the place of veterinarians. But we are all scientifically oriented and in positions to kind of take notes, make observations, and then report on those observations. So that's basically what we're doing. But for the record, one more time, this is the second time I'm saying it, we're not vets, so you do want to consult your veterinarian before you do anything. So updates with me before we get in with the guest. I don't really have any updates other than the fact that the school year has officially begun. And last week was great. I prepped for it. I have a light teaching load for once, and light for me means 11 hours. And everything was going well. And then on Friday, a freaking bomb exploded, I feel like, at the university. As soon as you start to feel like, okay, it's okay, boom, we had a rack that the level of infestation of mites that were in this rack was like astronomical. And what's kind of nutty about it is we were in that rack earlier in the week and we couldn't see a mite anywhere. So it's inspired me to bring up with Matt. I think we need to just have a history / biology of snake mites and how to kill the little bastards episode, because the past 72 hours of my life have been guiding students through this dealing with this infestation, and they just kind of, as is the case often, popped up out of nowhere, but they didn't. Somebody brought them in, or they were moved from one enclosure to another. So that's pretty much been it. And we just recorded last week, so it's not been that much time in between recordings this time.
Yeah, Zach, I think that's a great episode because one of the things I've always talked about, too, is it's not always about treating. But when you have a large collection, in most cases, what you want to do is preventatively treat not only the internal of the cage, but also the outside of the cage. I am a large supporter of a product that's commercially available that I use as a preventative aspect. And, it might even be something where we invite that person on because they've done a lot of research respective of snake mites too, because this is such an interesting aspect. And, they are very specific to how they actually infestate, collections on a larger number.
Yeah, no, I hate them. And it seems like this was really interesting because we were in that rack. The rack was actually set to come to my house, which thank God we caught it before it came here. And the rack was completely on its own in a room by itself, kind of in a self-induced quarantine. And nobody really interacted with the rack other than, basic care. But we started interacting with it the week before school started. And the sheer volume of mites in those tubs was just like, how? And it was really interesting because we have so many people in those tubs, or at least checking water, that I know that it went from like 0 to 1,000 in a matter of like 5 days, which is kind of insane. So no, I think that a snake mite episode is well worth it because they plague everybody. At some point, you're going to experience them. And I just think it'd be cool to do our deep dive on the biology of the beast. I can certainly do that, being that I do arthropod biology on the side, outside of the snake thing, So anyway, but no, that's a future episode. But other than that, nothing new for me. Anything new for you?
No, it's really been kind of one of those things where just kind of monitoring the collection. I'm actually in the process right now of looking at some projects that I have going on, and I might actually cut out a few projects just because of some holdbacks that I've had over the years. So there might be some posts made to fauna classifieds primarily, maybe morph market, respective of that. But, one of the things, Zach, you and we talked about respective was how we're going to relate to questions that come over on Facebook and Messenger specific to this podcast. Just because, one of the hard parts for Zach and I is just our time commitments. Obviously, we enjoy this podcast, but when we get, overwhelmed with messages specific to CCR Radio, we want to make sure that we're following up with it in a timely manner. But also, I think one of the bigger parts of this is the educational aspect of it, because a lot of people are afraid to ask questions. I mean, it's just like being in a classroom. You don't want to be the person in the back room raising your hand, and there are no stupid questions because usually every person as an audience has that same question. So Zach and I, we chatted last night, and I think one of the things that we're going to start doing going forward is if someone does send a question to us, we're going to actually refer to that question first on in this podcast, answer that question in this podcast for the upcoming week, and make sure that we answer it so that everyone that is a listener or follower to this podcast gets that knowledge too as well.
Yeah, 100%. And if you're wondering something or you have a question, we now know that we have quite a few listeners. There's probably somebody else out there. So we get a bigger bang for our buck trying to get word out and knowledge to the masses if we answer it on while we're recording than if we answer it with you. I guess if you don't want the question to be asked publicly, you can let us know that. But otherwise, we're gonna let it rip. And the questions that we get have been great. Some of them have made me really think. And I love doing that, keeping these things and having the critical thinking element to it is what makes it fun. So by all means, you have a question, send them our way. And then I'm going to put one more plug out there. We haven't said this in a while, but if you have a guest that you want us to talk, to reach out to, that's how we found Daniel Lawrence, for the record. Please let us know. We are definitely getting into the busy swing of things. So if you send a message to CCR on Instagram or Facebook, we may not see it because we don't check that one necessarily every single day, but you can always send it to at least my personal account because I use Messenger to communicate with my students. So I'm looking at it about, 2 times an hour, it feels like, during the actual day. And I will definitely get the message there. So, yeah. Anything else, Matt?
Well, following up off of that, someone asked recently a question about how do you disinfect and clean multiple deli cups when cupping snakes. And I think this is actually a very important question, respective of following up on the feeding colubrids and hatchling episode that we did. And since I do this in high numbers, I thought I would probably just jump in on this. So what I end up doing is actually soaking all of those deli cups in a ammonia solution in a 55-gallon drum garbage can. And then afterwards, I'll actually scrub them, and I'll have 3 garbage cans set up, one for soaking, one for rinsing or cleaning or washing out, and then one for like just a final dunk. And then I set all of those containers out in sunlight to basically be exposed to UVB, to kill out anything that might actually be exposed in that process. That's what I have found to be a very important aspect of disinfecting and cleaning. But I think even in today's episode, we might even talk about, the difference between cleaning and disinfecting and sterilizing cages, appropriate aspects of water bowls, different aspects of things that might also be inside of a cage that might not necessarily be cleaned or disinfected properly, because all of that can actually lead to different levels of parasite load or also viruses being transferred to your collection.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think people truly understand how incredibly lethal the sun is. If you are a microorganism, it is quite literally hell. If you are exposed to just flat out bright sunlight, it kills so many things. And adding that step after, you add all the man-made detergents and cleaners and sterilizing agents, that's going to certainly wipe it out. And then when you add that last little cherry on top of baking it in sunlight, you just put the death nail in the coffin at that point. So
well, and in the hobby, a lot of people think, oh, bleach is like the best disinfectant. It's like, no, it really isn't. So
yes,
and you also have to be careful too, based upon that, how it actually relates into your collection.
Sure that. Okay. So there, we've answered our first question from the Facebook page to the podcast. So, all right, cool. Excellent. Are we ready to jump in with Jen?
I think we jump in, man.
Okay, cool. So, our guest today, as stated previously, Dr. Jennifer Archer. Jen for the rest of the time, because we're formal to a point, and then that formality goes away. So how are you doing tonight, Jen?
How you doing, Zach?
I'm doing
nice to be here.
Yeah, doing well. Looking forward. When we came up with the podcast way back when, I thought, yep, Jen's definitely coming on. So we discussed when you would come on, what we would talk about, and decided that indeed this whole crypto thing, strongyloides thing, aseptic, septic technique in your collection thing, definitely worth discussing. But before we get to that thing, or that aspect of tonight's episode, let's just hear a little bit about your back. First, let's hear your background with animals, and then let's hear your academic background. So, have you always been a snake nerd, not a snake nerd, recently a snake nerd? When did you become a snake nerd?
A snake nerd, I'm definitely one now. I don't know when I can say that began per se, but if I go back to when I was a kid, I was just one of those kids that had to play with all the wildlife I found in my backyard. So some people, this is a big reveal. My first favorite animal was the American toad.
There you go, cool.
And every summer, it was just the most amazing thing in the world to find a toad. I'm sure every other little girl on the planet, I thought they were experiencing the same thing as me, and I don't think that was the same case, but that was me. And then I found there were garter snakes. I grew up in Connecticut, so I live in Florida now, but I had, of course, a very different. I didn't grow up with lizards. I think that was kind of one of the coolest things about moving here and visiting family that lived down here was seeing all these lizards, because that's something we don't see in Connecticut. We had salamanders. I had painted turtles for a little bit. I used to go to the local town park, and I'd catch the little baby turtles, and then my mother would have a conniption, but I made my mom deal with it. My dad was like, okay, I'll help clean the tank, and so I had the toads. I had snakes in buckets, I never really knew how to take care of them, and we usually just let them go after a few days if they manage to not dehydrate before then, because when you're, an elementary school kid, you have no idea. It's all foreign to you, the husbandry and all that stuff. And back in the day, my favorite book was called, I used to go to the library and check out this book called The World of the Frog and the Toad. It's an excellent book. You can still buy it on eBay. I just bought it like a year ago for like $7, something like that. And it's actually a great historical piece when I look back at it. Because that was what we knew back then. We didn't have the internet back then. We had the Dewey Decimal System when I was in elementary school, and I would take out that book, and I kind of hid because I wasn't pulling out fiction, and I didn't want other students to know I was doing that.
Cool.
But I had to know where it lived and what I was supposed to feed it, and so that's kind of my backstory. Is I grew up in Connecticut and kept a bunch of wildlife in my house that my mom didn't approve of. But my dad was fairly supportive of it. And so then
at what point did you bring in the captive snakes?
So this is actually an odd story. So I don't want to go too much in depth about my school, but graduate school. Let me just say this real quickly, since I know I'm not used to this audience. It's kind of this mental. It's like drill sergeant kind of. It'll mentally break you. We'll put it that way. And so while I'm in grad school, and I had some roommates. I ended up with some roommates that this one guy, he just said, I took him to a reptile show. I started going to reptile shows since 2002 here in Florida, but I never really. I owned a chameleon, and that was really cool. But I had to on a whim learn how to take care of the chameleon, because they're like, oh, just feed it crickets. Well, it turns out that you can't just feed it crickets. You need to gut load them and put calcium on them and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. So I figured it out eventually, but it was not until I had that roommate that said, you should get a snake. And I said, man, aren't those just really expensive and very difficult to take care of? And I knew nothing about snakes. They were just these really foreign, beautiful animals, but I thought they were like the husbandry and the care. You had to spend thousands of dollars. And he's like, no, man, you can just keep them in a clip container with some water. And I'm like, really? And he's like, you can just buy pinkies frozen in a bag, buy 100 of them. We'll share that together and we can both get a snake. And he wasn't really a big reptile person per se. He was just a roommate I had that thought it was cool to have a snake. And so he talked me into it. And I said, are you going to help me with it when I screw it up? And he's like, yeah, I'll help you with it. And so can you guess what my first snake was?
A Florida king snake?
It was a Florida king snake.
Okay, there you go.
It was I was told it was a hypomosaic. And I got it from Kevin Enright. And it turned out that it wasn't even a mosaic. It was just, people didn't really know necessarily. Somebody bought it. Somebody said, this is what it is. And they passed it off. And
gotcha.
And it was a cool little bugger. And I had the same I guess one of the things I really like about this radio is I can talk about my experience, because I'm pretty late in the game. Even though I was into the wildlife as a kid, I wasn't keeping them in captivity for very long, or with trying to learn the husbandry and all that stuff. So I've got that perspective of I was the total noob. I'm a molecular biologist. I work with RNA and DNA and that stuff and polyamines.
Yeah.
So, not everyday stuff. And so coming in and that's one of the things that's where we started working together, was because you're a field biologist and I have the molecular biology background, and it's just totally different fields. Oh. We don't even speak the same language in peer-reviewed journal articles.
No. Totally different language between yours and mine.
It is. And I can hold a pipette and not crush it in my hand, and you can jump 3 feet onto a snake and catch it. And I probably can't.
Yeah, so. That's about right.
Stop breaking the Eppendorf pipettes. So I've always been in that DNA, RNA, the stuff that you hear about in the classic kind of the high school biology, that stuff. I was not a field person. It was just a roommate. It really was just a roommate that said, these are cool, we should get one. And so I did. So I picked up that Florida king snake, and the first problem I had with it was it did great at 8. It was doing well. And what do you think happened to this snake? Well, the same thing that happens to most people when they own their first snake. It escapes. because I went to a reptile show and I picked up some random cage that he told me to buy. I pulled a heat pad. That's it was actually a glass tank with one of those lids, and the lid wasn't sitting on there properly. It was enough that the snake got out.
Gotcha.
And so my very first snake, I did find it eventually when I kept smelling this awful smell from behind my entertainment system. And I took that thing apart. I took that entertainment system apart, and then behind it, it's like it's coming from the wall. And so we actually managed to. We took off the. There was an electrical socket there, and we took that panel off, and we're like. So that's what happened to my first snake. And so, one of the things that we take that for granted because a lot of us have figured out that these things are escape artists. But for somebody new, that's like the first challenge you have to do when owning a king snake is make sure it doesn't escape. And it seems so trivial, but if you look on like the corn snake groups and the king snake groups on Facebook, every week we see at least 5 posts. My snake escaped. How do I find it? And that's something I think as a community we really need to work on is working on that kind of security because it doesn't look good for us. It upsets everybody. And then we get people that go on the internet and bully them. How did you let your snake escape? Blah, blah, blah. And we don't want that kind of behavior. We want to encourage people to just, yes, I made a mistake. And, I've come a long way since that. Right? Now I've got, then I ended up with 80 something of them.
Yeah. And then you produce quite a few. So fast forward to just this past year, how many animals do you think that you've produced?
That actually, definitely somewhere between 150, 200, something like that. Yeah. Not counting the ones that you have over there right now.
And then,
so the luck of the.
Yeah. So in an effort to. One of the things that I love about Jen is we are at West Liberty. We have the animal. So I spent the first 6 years of the Zoo Sci major I talk about all the time. And that was basically building the collection of animals that the students were going to learn how to do herpetoculture with. We needed to have diversity so that we could actually do some projects where we could compare pythons to colubrids to dipsadids, so on and so forth. But I was looking for a colony of animals that would basically be mine. Once you get the community lab set up as a researcher, I want my own animals that basically I take care of and one other student, and that's it. And I was talking with Jen, and she graciously donated quite a few adult Florida king snakes. And if you all saw the photograph that I put up online on my Instagram account that basically said this is my favorite room on campus, the purple and yellow room, the king snakes that are in there are Jen's and I's, and it's basically a communal colony between her and I for research projects that we're going to do. So with that being said, that's your intro to snakes. You have the Florida Kings. We'll talk about Florida Kings in 1 minute. But I do want the audience to kind of know just briefly, what's your academic background? Because Matt and I both were kind of in organismal biology. Matt did the physiology, I did ecology, and you're a biologist like us, but what's the background for you?
Well, that's just the thing. I'm not a biologist like you. You're one of those people that goes out into the field and jumps on things, and I go field herping twice a year for fun. Mm-hmm. So I'm the person that works with the DNA, the RNA, the protein, the stuff that sounds a lot like COVID, infectious disease, bacteria, all those scary science words that sounds like science fiction. That's the kind of stuff I do. So I guess my degree was called molecular and microbiology, and then they changed the name to biomedical sciences just to make it sound sexier for some reason. But I work a lot on the molecular side. A lot of people have questions for me, like, is PCR real? And a lot of that comes from COVID. Is it real? Yes, it's real. Yes, it's an industry standard. We use it in all the hospitals. There's a lot of stuff, and I understand because I don't feel like, and this is why we do the podcast, is the general public doesn't get to see the background and the science sometimes, so they really question what's going on. Is this real? Is this just made up from Russia? What is it? Is COVID real? Is it a real virus? And there's trying to breach that connect between the communities. I think it's important we do that, especially because we have a lot of people that are very knowledgeable with the animals they work with. And just because they don't have a doctorate in front of their name doesn't mean that they don't contribute, but we don't have it formal. And I think that's one of the things you've been working with more and more people that don't have those degrees, but they've spent 10 years out in the field and they know exactly where these animals are. And they know better than the people in some of the research labs because they just don't get a chance to get out there as much as they do. So with experience, you can't just say just because somebody has those letters in front of their name, they know more. They probably know more about what they specifically study than you, but that's to the extent where that goes.
Yep.
It's like very limited to your very narrow research.
Yeah, your little narrow window of all
narrow
your life.
window.
So
that's
Jen,
why you're the king of the crayfish because there's pretty much no one else in the world that's well renowned for crayfish.
Yeah.
So Jen, what brought you into that field of science, if you will? Was that something you just kind of fell into? Was it something that you were looking for that sexy keyword to really like set yourself off in the academic world, or?
What's funny is that I really loved all the animal biology stuff, but my parents were very concerned about me. They said, you can't become a biologist because it doesn't make any money. That's what my parents told me. They're like, you can do that for fun, but you're not allowed to be a biologist. You're not allowed to be a marine biologist. You're not allowed to do any of that because you'll never make any money. Boy, are they disappointed with my PhD. So, that doesn't make any money either, but... I just kind of fell in love with all the micro stuff. So as my dream when I was a senior in high school was to work on the Human Genome Project. But when I got to college, it was already completed 2 years early. So I didn't get to work on it.
Yeah.
That was my life goal at the time. I put the toads aside for a little bit. I was still bringing them in. I was still doing things like that. But I think, just growing up and going to college, your mind, you get focused on what you need to do to be an adult. And so you have to put some of your toys down for a little bit. And that is a sacrifice you have to make in order to succeed. And then there's me who went back to it in grad school because I needed those toys snakes are not toys, but fun things. Yeah. I needed that. The snakes probably are they were my most emotional support animals to get through the rest of my graduate school and that disaster. Yeah. So I had like 12 of them, I think, by the time I graduated with my PhD, but I really didn't get to do a whole lot with that until afterwards. Before it was just like every other noob. You got to start somewhere with the husbandry, and there isn't like there is no college course snake husbandry 101. Maybe you have one there that you teach, but we don't have that. So I had to figure it out with just a roommate, based on what he said. And I did a lot of trial and error. And of course that would be unnecessary now that we have all these Facebook groups. I don't think Facebook was really a thing back then. We couldn't share all that information that we had with our peers. And I think we really are making a lot of progress on the educational front and how we keep animals and what we can do to protect ourselves and protect the animals. We'll get, I guess, let's pull that out for the disease a little bit. But, fortunately, snakes are not generally very zoonotic. They don't tend to bring in a lot of stuff that's going to make us sick unless you're picking it from another country where they've got like blood flukes and things like that. And that's a big nope for me. Yeah.
And to get the blood flukes, you kind of have to decide to eat your snake, which is hopefully not something people do. But you could potentially get something from the.
You forget to wash your hands. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you forget to wash your hands, and you lick your hands, or what you decide to eat some chicken wings, and that's what freaked me out when I saw those the lungworms. And that's another story from another day.
So, final question before we move into the meat and potatoes with the disease and vectors and such. So one of the things that I have enjoyed talking to you about is most people know I'm not necessarily what you would call a morph person. I don't poo-poo morphs. I did not do well in my genetics class. I did better in my evolution classes. And then I look at the paint jobs and the phenotypes, and I kind of I can't keep track of what the hell I'm looking at. And then I talk to Jen about this stuff, and she just, bam, rattles it off and talks about this cross and that cross will equal this and this and this and this. So I know that's an important part to you in your herpetocultural career. So at what point did you kind of realize, A, that the morphs existed and that you could breed them, and then kind of take your collection to another level from your 12 snakes to the 100-plus snakes I inherited from you a couple months ago?
So that was the problem right there. Was it became kind of what got me into the king snakes was that there were different morphs and they were colorful. The ball pythons, if that's your thing, I just couldn't get into that. But I just really fell in love with the king snakes, and that roommate said either get a king or a corn snake. And I in that, with him teaching me and some other people, talking to people at the shows, I was like, wait a second. These really all are the same snake. I thought there were like 30,000 species of snakes at this reptile shows. When I first walked into one, I had no clue. I was like, are these different species, different genuses? What are they? And you start to actually sit down and look at them, and you're like, well, they look the same for the most part, just something slightly different about them. And it was kind of that realization. First I had a hypo, and then I had an axanthic, and so it was just like, cool, you can collect them all like Pokemon. And it's like, well, and the genetics part was what attracted me to it, was that, you could make all these different morphs. Mm-hmm. And I had never planned on being a breeder, but the breeders all talked me up. They're like, well, you could make this and this and that. And I was like, well, I'll raise them up and then maybe you can breed them. And that's what my thinking was at the time. I'll raise them up and you can do whatever it is you have to do to get them to breed. And I'll make the genetics project, but I had no intent on breeding when I got these. And so I had a collection. I had ideas of what to breed and how to make something really cool. But because of my background with the genetics and the RNA and DNA, that's what kind of got me. That's what got me hooked was the genetics. The fact that these were morphs, and that this Mendel stuff, this Punnett square stuff, which by the way, Zach, I'm going to make you have to do one, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So the stuff really works. This stuff Mendel's talking about with peas and pea plants and all this and flies, it really works. It's not just something we learned in our book that Pearson tortures us with.
Yeah.
It's real, and not only is it real, it's something that you're doing it old-fashioned way. Now we can genetically sequence things and cheat and do things like that, but there's just something about having to do it the way they did it in the 1800s. It's like how they used to have to do it, and you gotta there's something fun about that. It's like doing a Stone Age thing, and it's fun. So it's nerdy. I get it. Not everybody's into the morphs. Clearly, I didn't know there was a world full of geneticists out there, but when you run into all these ball python people and corn snake people, etc., it's a big thing. They love the genetics. They just don't know how to call it the right thing because they didn't take a biology class, but they understand the mechanism and how it works.
Yeah, no. And I do have to admit, when I've never, how do I say this? I've read about the morphs. And I've had I like hypos. Whenever anything has a hypo, I'm probably going to like it. But other than that, I have a tendency not to gravitate towards anything. And then these king snakes showed up, and you sent the spreadsheet. And I'm still going to be a locale guy and all that. But I will fully admit that it's been great for me to actually learn this terminology and language of the morph world. With this collection that I have, because I'll pull open the tub to go clean somebody, and I look at this thing, and I'm just like, good God, you're crazy looking. And before, I would just be like, it's pink. That's the extent of my knowledge. And now I can look at the spreadsheet and be like, oh, okay, this one's tyranase positive, tyranase negative. This one's axanthic or double het something. And it's been kind of fun to just on my own I quiz myself with the morphs the way I quiz myself when I'm in the field and I'm trying to learn like a new family of bugs. So I'll look and be like, all right, which species is this? Which species is that? You just take out species, put in morph. But I've gotten to the point where there's still animals I've fed multiple times now, quite a few times now, and I still can't remember what the hell morph they are or phenotype, and then they go to the spreadsheet. It's on my phone. But yeah, no. So, no, but it's interesting to hear. Like, this is kind of one of the things, a point I want to make, is that we all have different interests. So with, Archer here, she's into the genetics and the mechanism and, of inheritance and all that. So it makes total sense that morphs and phenotypes and things would be her jam. Whereas Mr. Ecology here, I look at a locale and I'm like, oh, this Pinellas King versus this Sand King versus this Brookside, which is not valid anymore, but at the same time, they're a different phenotype. I'm into that because I know that that's a phenotypic response to the habitats they're living in. So, tomato, it's kind of the same. So I just wanted to kind of hit on that a little bit and let everybody know that's how we do it.
What about hybrids? Are we going to get into that?
I hate hybrids.
Yeah.
I was like, if you're on that side, for sure. And then I'm like, the side of me is always like, genes do what they want to do. You get a snake or you don't. I mean, it's these arbitrary borders that we assign here, and we can argue about taxonomy all day long.
Yep.
And taxonomy and taxes, two things that you don't want to bring to Thanksgiving table.
No.
Well, and I think one of the harder parts too is, when you start to look at genetics and how you're actually studying genetics and like associating with alleles and how you're actually, there's so much in terms of now, well, let's take shed skins and do this analysis. But I don't think a lot of people realize how much actually goes into that in terms of the fact that DNA starts to degrade too as well. And those shed skins need to basically essentially be fresh. Especially right now, there's a big conversation of can we actually look at different morphs based upon shed skins and collect shed skins. But once you have that shed skin sitting there for several months, it's going to be very complicated, and your confidence or R squared off of that genetic material is going to decrease rapidly too as well.
Yeah, you want to get the shed and get it out the door. Like, comes off snake into envelope, and there you go.
Yeah, that brings me to, we do need that. I wanted to have a discussion anyway about proper collection and validation, because I think there is a big disconnect. And I think COVID really taught us that the general public is not really educated on, health practices and science practices. And so they hear the words like sterile techniques, and that doesn't mean anything to them. But we all benefit from it, because a lot of it translates, and really what it translates to is less disease,
yes,
or better experiment, or, and that's and people don't understand why necessarily. You have to follow very strict instructions when you're going to do science. You can't just grab a bag of poop and then swab it with any random swab, and then you've got pine in there or other substrate. And so it's important that when you design a test, you're always doing it in with the same methodology, the same way, and you've compared it to another valid method, to the point where you want to make sure your positives are really positives and your negatives are really negatives. And I get punchy with some of the academic research sometimes because they don't take the time to validate their research methods, and then they're like, well, I sent this specimen to another lab and it was negative here and was positive here. And it's like, well, for one, how did they process the sample? Because you can't just take poop or blood or whatever and just shove it in a thermocycler and expect to see, is this disease there? You can't do things like that. It's a little bit more complicated. And, that's why, when you talk to your vet, you need to get, your vet's going to use an appropriate collection kit. They need to. They don't just take a cotton swab and they mail that into where their lab is. No. So whatever lab you're using, you need to make sure it's going to a validated lab, that the vet's using, and that their vet should know how to properly collect that specimen, because it makes a difference what you're using. And so we have people that want to go take COVID tests. They want to drop off the Q-tip. You can't trust that data, because they put chemicals in there to degrade the snot, basically, without degrading the DNA. And that's how we can tell whether you have COVID or not. So if you don't collect it correctly, and it's negative, that doesn't mean you don't have COVID. It just means we couldn't detect it because it was contaminated. So these are things that everyday people don't really think about. They're just like, there's DNA in me, right? So I can detect it. But I feel like a broken record after working in a hospital and talking about CLIA and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But it is very important that, I know that there's independent labs. I know there's research labs, but be careful where you're sending your stuff to, making sure that they are. Always ask if they validated their method. That's the first thing to ask, and the second all is make sure they have the right. Usually, the way we work in any healthcare environment or sciences, everything comes in kits.
Yep.
You guys do some DNA work. You just bought a kit and a protocol. So we joke. I have a little funny YouTube thing about that. So you buy the QIAGEN kit, and you just follow the protocol, and it works because it does it the same way every time, and that's a validated method that you're using. So I just wanted to bring that up a little bit because I get people keep trying to give me poop samples to look at, and I'm like, I can't take a week-old poop sample in a bag with substrate in it, and you want me to see something on the microscope? I can't.
Well,
I can't do that.
Well, let's talk about why people are giving you poop sample. That's my segue. So So before we go any further, we are going to start a discussion about crypto. In Colubrid collections, I probably said crypto, and at least one listener had a cold shiver go down their spine. Crypto is without question in the Colubrid world kind of our Nido or serpentivirus or whatever you want to call it. And one of the things that's happened is both Jen and I independently have dealt with crypto in our collections, and what was interesting about our approach is we didn't do what a lot of people do, which is you find out you have crypto, you then go purchase the cheapest blowtorch you can find, and then kill everything, start over. We decided to do some science with this, and it's led both Jen and I to have a very different opinion of how to treat it, how to act around it, how to handle it. And I'm going to say I'm keeping track. This is the third time I've said this. This is based off our observations and not a veterinarian. So go to your vet. If your vet tells you something, listen to the vet, not us. But I'd like to, most people that have listened to this have listened to another podcast I'm on and they've heard my experience. So we don't need to go over that. But do you mind just kind of explaining how your first interaction with crypto inside your collection and your response to it before we talk about the vector stuff?
And before we get into that, I just want to remind everyone that you have 11% rebate from Menards, and they do have blowtorches there too as well.
Yeah. Yeah, if you go that route, there you go. Go pick yourself up a blowtorch.
Just trying to put some humor in this conversation.
Yeah. So when and how and why did crypto enter your life?
When you work in a hospital, don't ask that question there, because it's actually a human disease. A lot of people don't realize they associate crypto with, most of you probably associate that word now with currency, but you might, if you're a Colubrid person, you might associate that with the deadliest thing in your collection. And I had no idea anything about that, but I was pretty small time and at the time, and what I heard from everybody, I heard rumors about it. This is just this thing, and most people said it was a bacteria, and it just comes into your collection and it just kills it. It's dead in like a week, and that does happen to people, but that's not cryptosporidium. But and I can argue, if you tell people that it doesn't do that, they'll disagree with you, even though they don't really have the science to back it. But cryptosporidium is not. That's not one of the symptoms of crypto. Is your collection just randomly drops dead, and that's going to be something more on the viral side, and not. Or it could be a respiratory infection, something that I had bout of a few animals died because this, I'm a smart person and I don't always think when I'm half asleep. And I made a mistake of taking an air filter. I had an air purifier. I became like deadly allergic to mold at one point in my life, and I'm doing a lot better now. But so I used that to deal with the moisture, and I picked up all those spores. And then I forgot to change the filter, thinking I had changed the filter and completely forgot. Dirty filter was in there, and I had it in the room right next to a bunch of snakes, and a bunch of them dropped dead all of a sudden with respiratory issues. So you got to be careful with these are things you don't even think about.
Yeah.
All I did was put an air purifier in the room, and I was sick. I was very sick from it. I almost went to the hospital that night because I was so allergic to it. But, animals can have allergies and these toxins in the mold spores. So it's a Florida problem in general with and I bring that up because sometimes it gets too humid. And that's one of the things you can have in a husbandry issue is when your humidity goes too high, you start running into respiratory issues, and it can be bacterial, it can be fungal. And the fungal stuff is nearly impossible to treat.
Yeah.
They've just got to be able to fight it off on their own. So
with crypto, though, what made you think, crap, these things have crypto? Like, what were the animals doing?
So the biggest stressor, I guess, is moving them. And, I've moved so many times and God knows how long, and I moved. And just the animals started regurging, but I didn't really think anything of it because I knew they were stressed out from the travel. And that happens to a lot of animals. And I had like only a few of them in the same rack were doing it, or the ones next to it. So most of it wasn't doing that. And these were they weren't adults. They were probably, I like to say, fuzzy eaters. So they eat fuzzy mice that size. That's how I compare snake sizes, is by what food size they eat.
I like that.
So I've got my fuzzy eaters, and everything was bigger than them. And only these smaller snakes, and it wasn't all of them, they regurged and they just weren't they just couldn't keep food down. And I kept throwing Nutribac at them and things like that. And I finally went to my vet, one of my vets. I have multiple, and we did a wet prep, and he said it's there's a protozoan in here, but he couldn't identify it. And he said crypto is a possibility. And I'm like, how could it be crypto? Isn't it that thing that wipes out collections? Mm-hmm. Why aren't all my other animals regurging? And we know that regurging is just something that can happen anyway from poor husbandry, especially with temperature shock. And I've got stories about that type of stuff. I think the most detrimental thing I've ever happened to me is temperature shocks that have just knocked out a bunch of animals, like when I lost the wine cooler last year. These things are going to happen, and you sit there and you put temperature sensors on them and everything and try to control for these things. And it's never perfect. We've had a lot of big players lose animals due to failed thermostats and things like that, large collections. So it's, but I'm trying to get to the point that don't be discouraged, because things are going to happen that are unpleasant, where you may lose a bunch of animals because that just happens. And it could be, whether it be from disease or bad husbandry or a flood, whatever it may be. This is something that you have to be comfortable with loss when you're working with animals, because and I think so. It's not for everybody. If you can't handle an animal getting sick and needing to go to the vet, it's not for you. But we try to encourage you, keep going. You haven't succeeded until you've failed 10 times. That's generally how that works.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, and Jen, just to make a comment off of that, I mean, having been in this industry for the time that I've been in, I mean, one of the biggest commentaries that I would have to add to this is, when you work with life, you work with death.
Yeah, you have to.
Right. But also to that nature and factor is, I think one of the very interesting parts of this hobby is just the friendships and bonds that you build over time too, as well.
Yeah.
And with that being said, sometimes when you're working with these aspects and trying to overcome some of those obstacles, It's very interesting in terms of the supportiveness that the hobby brings, especially those connections that you have, because usually everyone wants everyone to succeed. Everyone wants everyone to have a good experience, if you will, because there's more to monetary gain in this hobby, respective of that. And I think that's something in terms of, being a responsible keeper, but also, when we're working with people that we trust, it's one of those aspects, and I think it makes the hobby much more stronger too as well, because when we look at it as an overall community, we want to make sure that we have people that are helping and aiding others' success with it. Because to me, and maybe this is the wrong word, but I would consider myself not only just a hobbyist, but I do consider myself a commercial breeder too at this point in time. And with that being said, I always want people that buy animals from me to have success in it. I mean, the coolest thing that I see is when people post pictures and they're like, eggs hatching, Matt Moe's Sarpamitra line. And I think that's awesome. I think that's very cool, because it shows that person took the time and care to actually raise that animal up from a hatchling to an adult and reproduce that animal in captivity. It's not the aspect that they're naming me in it, but I think it's very cool to see that they took the time to grow, raise the animal, took the captive husbandry aspects of it too, and really succeeded in it.
Yep.
That's awesome.
No, agree 100%. So, with your, so you got these animals regurging.
Yeah.
And did they
and
crash, or at what point? How did we get to ultimately determining it's crypto?
So I had met Dr. Lytle over at RAL and about the year before, and I saved his business card and a swab. And so when my vet had no idea what it was that he was dealing with, I just sent the swab in and checked it, and it came back positive. So at that point, I didn't really know what to do, but I knew something wasn't right, because all the other animals of larger size, not a single one of them had a problem. They were eating just fine. There was nothing unusual about them. There was just, everything was fine, So it's like, is this really what everybody thinks it is then? Because if everything's supposed to drop dead, one, why aren't they dropping dead? Because they did die eventually. Mm-hmm. But I kept nursing them with Nutrabac and all sorts of fluids and things, and they lived for quite a while, but eventually they died from emaciation. They just become so, they lose all their muscle mass, and they eventually get dehydrated if you don't keep enough fluids in them, which is, you got to kind of force fluids, and they'll eventually succumb because they can't absorb anything. And I had the veterinarian do a dissection so he could confirm it as well. So again, as scientists, we don't just say one test. We had a vet confirm there was a protozoa in there in a wet mount, but he wasn't sure what it was. And of course back then I was more on the molecular side of things. I really hadn't gotten to work with, done a lot of microscopy. I did a lot of microscopy with cells, but I had never really done it with the hospital way, and kind of, because I got into what I switched over to becoming a technologist instead of a research scientist. I was able to learn all those techniques pretty quickly, and I was like, wow, this is way easier than research. Why was I over in research this whole time? And,
yeah.
This is pretty standardized stuff, so yeah, I can stain for it, and it lights up. Like, I've sent you some pictures of some controls and a dead corn snake I have to be careful what I say on here. I put a corn snake in a room to see how long it would take to become infected when I had those animals, and I was trying to nurse them back to health, and just to see how long it would take for that I actually had two of them, and one escaped, and I still never found it. Speaking of the escape artistry,
hey Jen, just for clarification too, off the swabs, I would imagine you're talking about a fecal swab versus.
Yeah, so you can do a fecal swab with the right type of swab, by the way, not a cotton swab.
No.
A flock swab is usually speaking of proper specimens, discuss with your vet what the proper specimen is if you're going to collect an at-home sample instead of it there. But I had my vet collect a sample because you can swab the actual gut. You can also do a gut wash. There's things you can do. So when he dissected it, I had him actually collect that specimen, and I sent that one in. I sent that one over to RAL, and it also told me the species of it too. It was Serpentis there.
Well, and that's something I wanted to bring up too as well, because having done a lot with Purdue University and their veterinary students, I have had students come over and I've showed them how to do certain things of that nature too as well, because I think it is very important for, veterinary students to actually learn those techniques, because, there is more than one way to do this sampling, but I think there also is an aspect of, you could get a false positive off a fecal sample. And, you almost need that aspect where you might have more than one testing criteria for this.
Are you talking about the sandwich assay?
Yeah.
Okay, so let me give some background for the non-science folks. I'm going to try to be as lay as possible. There's 3 basic ways you can check for cryptosporidium that are sensitive enough to say that's what it is. So you've got PCR. That's the one everybody hears about now because of COVID. And so it's very difficult to get a false positive from that. If you're getting a false positive, that's usually due to contamination of some sort. So if you sent me 10 samples and you didn't wash your hands and you dumped the crypto in the clean sample, well, you're going to pull that out because it sees whatever you put in that specimen. So it's not that you can't get false positives, but you can get, if you don't, you don't have a sensitive enough design and your assay is not well enough, you can get false negatives though. Mm-hmm. And that's when you start doing these research labs that haven't validated and they can't tell you their sensitivity data. It's very questionable whether you truly have a negative or not. So that's why I get on. I'm getting on arguments. Zach's seen me online saying you can't use that lab; it's not validated, and I get on that case about it. But so that's that method. You're actually directly detecting the DNA, and so and crypto is a rock. So you have to develop a method. You can't. Remember, we were having that conversation about how you kept not picking up the crypto, but it's there, and I said, yeah, it's there, but something's wrong with I think you're losing your DNA when you're purifying it, for one, because you got too small an amount. And then you have to be able to you have to digest the crypto almost to get the DNA out of it. And that's the best way I can describe it. So there's a lot of processing that goes backstage and involved in the design for these tests. And because it's really boring, we don't generally talk about it with the general public. Exactly. But just know that it's not just, we don't just throw a specimen and a thermocycler and it works. There's a lot of work that goes into designing the assay, from the step of the collection, what you use to collect it, what you use to purify it, what you use, if you're even purifying it, what you use to detect it. And including the design of the primers themselves. So PCR is kind of the gold standard in the field, and that's species specific. Microscopy, the classic way of looking for that is actually doing an acid-fast stain, which I took upon myself to learn, and those are those pretty images that you see. Why my vet didn't know how to do that, I'm not sure. I don't know what they learn in veterinary school, but so he knew something was there by just looking at it in the wet mount, but you can't really identify it as crypto. Just, you can see there's a protozoa in there. You can't identify it as crypto. So all of that particular type of organism. So crypto, there's a few others. You can acid-fast stain them, and you can tell by the structures that's what it is. But you can't tell the species apart whatsoever. No. There's no way to tell that apart in the microscope. It all looks the same. You can't tell if this is tortoise crypto from human crypto. You just can't. So you have that downside. But you can see it. You can know if it's there. There's no question. There's no false positive. It's there. But you can't tell the species. And the reason we started talking was because we actually had the other method that was being used in the zoos was they were using the sandwich assays. So now I'm getting hungry. So these assays rely on, you have, there's a couple of different ways to do them, but generally you have something you're trying to detect that's a protein that's a physical part of the organism, and then you throw an antibody on it, and if it lights up, it's there. The only problem with that is that these sandwich assays also non-discriminately pick up all forms of cryptosporidium. And so I think we were looking at, rodents often get cryptosporidium. There's been outbreaks of cryptosporidium parvum, which doesn't affect reptiles whatsoever because it's species specific. And then, snakes eat rodents. Well, you can, PCR can tell the difference, but these sandwich assays that they're using in zoos were picking up cryptosporidium parvum potentially, and now no one really knows what to do with the animals, and they started euthanizing them for no reason. And we said this needs to stop because this is not, there's a disconnect between the zoology world and, what I do, essentially, working in the microscope and working with molecular techniques in these assays. So we know it's not specific. So how many animals have we fried for no reason because they were guilty of having Cryptosporidium serpentis and they did not? And then the other question is even if they had that, why did we need to fry it in the first place?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. So when I had the crypto outbreak, I wanted a quick down and dirty test to test the whole collection. And at first I thought I had my eureka moment. So I stumbled onto the acid fast staining. And we had a previous guest, Chad Foose, who talked about how one of the most important pieces of equipment he has for maintaining his collection is a microscope. And he uses the microscope to look at sperm motility. But as we're going to learn with Jen here right now, and then when we get to the worms, everybody can get a microscope and play around with the microscope. You can buy them on Amazon. I just bought one for my kid last year. That is better than the microscopes I had in high school, by the way. But we learned really quick at West Liberty that you could do this acid fast staining. And that's one of the things that Jen has done intensively with her collection post this initiation of I have crypto is you can just do a quick screen with an acid fast test. I don't know if you can buy acid fast stains. Well, like as a layman, or I guess you can. I got two people shaking heads at me. So
I would not recommend it. I'm not going to say you can, but
they're
and you do need to have a little bit of technique there on a good protocol. So it's something that you can learn as like if you want to take the time to learn it, you can. But again, it's and this is going back to using techniques. Is that I'm trained in sterile techniques and other things and disposal, and not the average person is. You can get some educational kit size things, but you really don't want to put these chemicals and things in your house. They're still not. Yeah. You don't want them near your dogs.
Yeah,
or your kids.
I think that xylene's involved therein, and you got to be a little careful. Yeah, stuff like that.
These things are meant to be used in a lab, not in your kitchen. Even though my kitchen island, there's a microscope on it.
But if you have thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars invested in a collection, it's probably worth being able to help your vet out a little bit. And the nice thing about this is you can actually see the damn organism if you have an oil immersion objective. And that's what was interesting
and you can,
to me.
And you can do it, and then you might want to verify your species as well. Please don't just mail slides to random labs too, because the dye, by the way, inhibits the reaction. It has to be worked up. And some of you are all going to run to the labs tomorrow, and they're all going to come back to me and say, like, why'd you tell us to send slides in, Jen? And I was like, I didn't, I swear.
You can't
it's doable, but they'd have to develop a way to do that more practically, because again, you're switching your sample specimen. So that was actually the first time that happened, and I said, my positive control is negative. My PCR, it's like that dye is in the way, and we have to deal with it now. So there was no protocol set up for it. We had to come up with it on the spot of how we were going to clean up that slide, so we could, and then compare the methods. And then we actually validated it against the PCR, and we were able to show that, our negative sides were negative and our positives were positive. So you're still going to get some sensitivity issues with the microscopy. It's still not as sensitive as the PCR.
No.
But it's, if it's there, it's definitely there.
Yeah. So
there's pros and cons to all the methods, and
so just to be like
obsolete at this point.
Just to be a devil's advocate on this one. Obviously, I'm not associated with a university, but having worked on a PhD and was trained as an anatomist and did a lot of work in histology. Yes, you can buy all of these chemicals. You can buy good microscopes that are valuable for this type of work. But the problem is, and this is 100% at the very beginning of this show that we talked about, is you need to make sure that you have a veterinarian review all of this. And I say that because of the fact that while I know what I'm looking at, and everyone on this episode that we're, obviously we have 3 people on here talking, the problem comes is, and in the community, this is very heavily seen, is people treat things improperly. And
100%.
You need to have a veterinarian review items.
And there are treatments coming out for Cryptosporidium. There is, Zach, you've looked in the literature. I know you're involved with some of it, and I know some other things coming out. So it's not, one of the takeaway messages I do want people to have from this is, one, if you get it, most people have had it in their collection, and a lot of them don't even know it.
Yeah,
100%.
And it may be gone. So that's one thing. One point, don't freak out because you got something in your collection. Everybody does, and if they don't, they're lying.
Correct. And Jen, off of that.
I know, it's been a taboo subject forever, and I said, I will break the ice on it,
Yeah, and one of those...
We'll talk about... What's that?
Oh, I was going to say, one of the things more than likely we should review at the very end of this is, ethically and morally, what do you do when your collection does test positive for this? Because there have been a lot of people that have done it. Well, you want to talk about it now, or you want to just leave it at the end?
Let's leave it.
We can pull that in.
Leave it at the end, maybe.
Let's leave it at the end because I've got
leave it at the end.
2 more things
we'll
I want to talk about.
With that. Yeah, that works.
So the reason why I thought that it might. I'm not by any means promoting with the scope and everything that you throw the vet to the side and you're going to go rogue and do this on your own because you are.
No, you need to work with a vet.
This is literally.
You need to be working with a vet because it's and the other thing is handling, and I want to cover some basic handling things that I worked in an RNA lab for a few years, and RNA is the thing you look at it wrong and it degrades and your sample is done with. And so you have to be very, very careful of how you move your body and sterilization. You mentioned talking about, how you deal with tubs and all that. And there's just a lot of things you don't really think about. What is sterilization? What is clean? What do these words mean to us in the community? Because as you mentioned earlier, a lot of people think bleach kills everything. Bleach does not kill Cryptosporidium, and you don't want to drink it because it'll kill you. It'll kill cancer. We're trying to. Your ultimate goal is to get rid of the organism and minimize its presence in your collection, and ideally eliminate it. It doesn't have to be zero. Everything in the wild has parasites in it. Mm-hmm. There's no such thing as a wild animal with 0 parasites. There's always something in it, but they manage to survive just fine. And why is that? Well, for one, they have the entire ecosystem they're in to move about, and they can sit there and bake themselves in the sun in 95 degrees. People are like, you can't keep that snake at that temperature. This is actually, they'll go on a heat mat that's 95 degrees, and that's one of the best ways to help to fight disease if something shows up. Your vet will tell you, hey, this has this got this infection, I've had eye infections. This is, you need to put it on a heat mat and let it cook itself. That's how their immune system works. They can't give themselves a fever when we get sick. We give ourselves a fever, but a snake is considered cold-blooded. They're not capable of really doing that to the extent we are. So they have to move to get where they need to go. And so the way you take care of an animal that's sick, you can't just put it in a rack system and be okay with it. You do have to set up a medical tub for it with those temperature gradients so that and it knows what to do. They have instinct. They just seem to know. Mm-hmm. And it works because people have tried it, and you put that heat on there and you give them 2 different heat spots, and you put a really hot one and a really cold one and a medium one. You just put this gradients there, and they seem to know what to do because they're constantly doing this. This is what they do in the wild. They change gradients so they can fight disease. Otherwise, the snake would be perfectly content, probably sitting under. A king snake would just sit under a log the whole day and just safely, not worried about getting eaten by an eagle or something like that.
So,
it's a scary world for a snake.
So obviously, you're trained in sterile technique. We're going to go back in time. You found out.
I'm ADD. I go on.
It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. You found out that you've had the crypto. I want to get to the vectors, and so you start asking this question of how is it moving from snake to snake? So one of the things a lot of people do. Well, in your experience, though, like story time, how did you end up figuring out how the crypto was moving through the collection if you're being hypervigilant, wearing gloves, and using all this training you have working in medical labs not to transfer the spores from one animal to another?
Well, that's part of the problem. I wasn't at first because I didn't know there was a problem. I mean, I knew there were some issues in my collection. I could tell by the smell of the poop something was wrong. But most of the stuff that actually I blamed crypto on wasn't crypto at all. Crypto was probably the least of my problems with dealing with husbandry. And it was one of those that just everybody blames it. It's just this, everybody likes to witch hunt this organism. And I'm not saying it's not an issue, but you know, it can be easier to deal with than other things that get into your collection. And just trying to get rid of stuff is difficult. But you know, ultimately, some things you can do. This is not necessarily veterinary advice, but this is just general husbandry advice. So, for example, a lot of hobbyists will throw a rodent in, and now it didn't get eaten. Okay, and you can probably, you know, those rodents, the king snakes, they can go. It's not like us that if it's out of the fridge for 4 hours, we'll probably die from it. But they can eat roadkill. They can handle a lot of things. So. But what happens is people take the mouse from one cage and, you know, they spot clean, and there's fecal matter in there. It's not perfectly clean, even though it visually looks clean. And then they put the mouse in the next cage where it didn't get eaten, because we all know that mice now cost like $1.50 or something outrageous like that a piece, and we want to all save money, especially when you have a large collection. And you've got to start, and you move that one item that has been contaminated essentially with whatever was in that cage, and you moved it into another cage now. So that's one way if you want to reduce spread, is to just not reuse rodents from one cage to another, because now you've got that on there. And that's something anybody can do. It's a little bit more wasteful, but if you're concerned about something in your collection, that's one of the ways to do it. And then, of course, actually cleaning your tubs regularly so there's no buildup of fecal matter that can house that stuff and let it stay alive in there. And washing your hands in between handling each animal, handling each cage. And I know that's a lot of work, but that's what we do in hospitals before we started hand washing. And it doesn't have to be antibacterial soap, by the way, which will do nothing for crypto either, because it's not a bacteria. But just washing our hands with soap and water. Soap is, by nature, it's slippery. And that's what it does, is it just gets rid of everything off of your hands. You don't have to kill it. You just have to make it go away. So I get people that get really crazy with these disinfectants. And when you're in like hard-to-reach places, I understand it's good to have a good disinfectant, but ultimately soap and water should be enough as long as you're scrubbing and doing a good job. And bleach itself is also soapy. You know, it's a base. A lot of times I just put all my small tubs in a bleach bath. I just get a big polypropylene tub from Walmart, and I just soak them in there, and you spray it and everything just comes off because you made it slippery, and you can add a little soap in there as well. That's another way to do it. And of course, as Zach brought up, UV light will kill essentially anything, but unfortunately, after 10 years of polypropylene sitting out in the Florida UV, my cages are getting warped from that as well. It's not very kind of plastic either, and I had an escapee as a result of a 10-year-old tub that just got too warped. So that got decommissioned the other day.
Well, and off of that even too, I don't think a lot of people realize that plastic is porous.
It is. Yeah. So you got to be careful what chemicals you put on there, but make sure you're using polypropylene and not polystyrene tubs. That's step one, because you will melt your polystyrene if you start throwing many of the common household chemicals in it. Cool. So I don't want to completely bore you to death with this stuff, but wash your hands between cages. Think of it as, imagine there's like a toxic dye, and it's just like, and it's, you can just use any dye really, and you would see like, how would I get it from not getting to the other cage? That's kind of the mentality you got to think about, is how do I not get it from point A to point B? And if you can do that, you can really reduce in your handling passing on infectious disease. If you're if you're putting two animals in the same cage, some people do that. They like to cohab, and then, so when breeding time comes, now they're in contact. So these things happen. So these are just some of the. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, talking about disinfecting and cleaning, what are your thoughts on using peroxide?
Well, that's the standard we've been using, is 12% peroxide, which is pretty strong, anywhere from 6, and we're just spraying the heck out of it. But I don't think any of us have actually figured out how effective that is. We know it works, but like what percent is okay, and how many treatments do we need? And really, that's just for stuff that when you have those nooks and crannies you want to get into that you can't get otherwise.
Yeah. So, well, and I think that's important too, to recommend different aspects of cleaners or disinfectants too, because I've always been told ammonia, peroxide, but also the exposure to UV.
But with the peroxide, it's important that people realize, because I've had people tell me this, you're not going to run out to CVS or Walgreens, Walmart, buy peroxide, come in. That peroxide is going to tickle it. It's not going to kill it. And what's really interesting is there were some papers that were done out of Europe, and they actually used the term deactivate. And I did a little bit of digging into that, and I talked to a couple parasitologists I know. And what's crazy about the cryptosporidium organism is when they say deactivate, what that literally means is it's just going to stop its ability to replicate. There's not really evidence of biological death. That's how much of a badass this little protozoan is. So to get the peroxide that does the damage, you can absolutely get it on Amazon. I've said this multiple times on many, many podcasts. You have to wear gloves. You have to do this in a ventilated space. If you get it on
your PPE.
If it gets on your skin, wherever it hits is going to turn white and flake away, and it hurts. Like you will.
Yes.
It's a slow burn. When it gets on you, you don't realize it's there, and then you kind of like ouch, 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 and then next thing you know, you look down, and then there's the white. And I am absolutely speaking from personal experience, because on several occasions it's gotten just past the lip of the gloves I'm wearing or something like that.
It sucks.
It's not fun. And it's I get 4 gallons of it for about $100, so it's $25 a gallon, and that's at the 12%. I think it's cleaning grade is what you want. But what I'd like to switch topics just a little bit, and just go straight for it this time. Let's talk about flies, because everybody that has a lot of snakes, especially if you have racks, it seems like inevitably you will get what you'll perceive to be fruit flies that come into your collection. And a little bit of entomology goes a long way, because you could absolutely have Drosophila in there. I'm not going to say you wouldn't. There's yeasts in there. They're attracted to the yeast. But if your little fruit flies are running around like maniacs and they don't want to fly that much, and you look down in the bedding and there's flies running, they'll fly. They're flies. But running amongst the bedding, especially around the feces, you are dealing with our good friends, or worst nightmare, you choose, phorid flies. So I know you've done quite a bit of work with phorid flies. So at what point did you realize that that you had flies could be the vector here? Because I know that you've gone to great lengths to experiment with ways to keep the flies out of the tubs. So I'd just like to talk a little bit about the flies.
Yeah. So, I mean, that was kind of the obvious problem was that, once I knew I had an issue and I had to be more careful with, recycling rodents and things like that and getting the techniques down, the problem is what can I do? And it wasn't even just flies. I had these soil mites. It turns out, you remember me messaging you, what the heck is this? It's not a snake mite. Yeah. I don't know what this is, but I want it gone. And so arthropods just classically, because remember I did most of my work with humans, but a lot of it, and rodents and E. coli for that matter, but a lot of that actually translates to veterinary science. We know what we know about Cryptosporidium because it's a problem in humans and it's a problem in livestock. Your steak is expensive when there's a bout of diarrhea going around with calves. So there's a lot of interest in solving this problem for all species, not just for snakes and not just colubrids. And so, I immediately blamed the fly for that. And so I think it was, I'm trying to think back now. I said, well, what if we could test the flies and see if they actually test positive for Cryptosporidium themselves? We just put a collection together and we just make it concentrated with flies and see what, or actually we decided just to keep just a standard collection that gets, I think we decided on how often does a typical person spot clean and all that, and that amount of flies. And so I sent them over to get PCR tested. And me and Chad had both been talking about that, about, what can we do here? Because you can't just throw flies into a thermocycler either. So we had to get creative. And now we have these little fly grinder bead grinders, which makes for, again, this is not the talk you can have at Thanksgiving dinner, but you can have with your science friends about smashing flies. So, they were being used for another purpose before, and now that we decided that, okay, let's see if we can use the flies and clean this up. And so he agreed. I mailed a jar full of flies. I wonder what the post office, the people that work there, wonder if these things bust open they look at it and like, what are they mailing? But at least it's going to a lab, so I think they're less concerned about it.
Yeah.
And so the flies themselves were testing positive at the time.
Yes.
When I was continuing to work with it, because I was like, well, I'm already dealing with this, when I had those, and I tried to save those animals. And so the flies were testing positive because those animals were symptomatic and they had full-blown infection. So we tested all that. But the curious thing that really shot down the whole belief that crypto instantly kills your whole collection is, so not only did it not kill those at all, but why weren't any of the other animals in the room, why didn't they have it? And I tested individual samples from that room as well, and they all came back negative. So, we had to really think about this. What's really going on here? Are they just not getting it because my techniques were too good? Probably not, because the room was full of flies, and that was designed for that test to begin with. But, we have this paradigm here that everyone believes this thing, and it's like, why aren't the rest of the snakes that have been isolated in this room and on lockdown, why aren't they dying? Why aren't they regurgitating? Why are they eating? And why did they come back negative?
Yes.
And that's really where we said, it's not necessarily, is this really a death sentence? Is this thing really as problematic as people think it is? And it is a problem. We're not going to say it's not, but could their own immune systems be fighting it off? I mean, when you're dealing with small animals, it takes them time to develop their immune system. which makes sense because the only things that showed symptoms were the smaller animals in the collection. They're eating, I think nothing ate larger than a hopper at any point that had symptoms, but everything larger than that was perfectly fine. And I tested it, I think, multiple times, and I'm like, is this really the data? This is really what we have, and they're negative. So do they fight it off on their own? And, one day, my buddy John, I got really frustrated with this snake that ate its sibling. Usually you don't have to separate king snakes until they have gone through their first shed. They don't tend to want to eat. They usually don't want to start eating for at least a week until after shed. You always have that's the problem with biology. Biology is messy.
Very messy.
You might have, and that's the other point, that it's not chemistry. Chemistry, you throw these chemicals in a reaction, you put this exact grams and you weigh it, and you always get the same result every time. But if you take 100 animals in a room, one might have one symptom, one regurgitates, one doesn't eat food, one of them just has smelly poop but no other symptoms. You don't necessarily get the same expression of disease in every single thing. And I think COVID taught us a lot about that too. Some people will get really sick and can die from it, and other people have no symptoms.
Yeah.
So, you gotta train your brain to think that, like a biologist, where you don't have, it's not a chemistry at all where you're going to have variance in there. And so you're working with that variance to begin with, but we look at trends. And so it is definitely an observation that when we have heard about collections going down from Cryptosporidium, they're always the small stuff. It was the stuff that didn't have enough time to develop an immune system. And then so the snake, so this little king snake, this little jerk that ate his sibling and lived through it, by the way, I just got so mad at that snake. I was like, and my friend didn't have time to pick him up. I'm just taking the condom off, and I'll go into what that means in a minute. And I just put it there in the crypto room, and I'm like, all right, you're the testament to this, buddy. So he got it. So he got the snake, and a couple months later, it started regurgitating. And so he brought it over, and I acid fast stained it, and sure enough, it was positive for crypto, because I had it with the concentrated fly thing that I at the time. So. And that snake, and I said, well, I would probably stop feeding it and fast it for a bit. I don't know what's going to happen, but once they start showing symptoms like that, prognosis seems to be pretty low, that it recovers from that. And so we checked it like every month, and there was still crypto there, and his kid insisted on feeding it. And then after a few months, he said, it doesn't have symptoms anymore, and I started running fecals on it, and they kept coming back negative. And this animal is almost this animal is an adult now. He said, it's been that long. You don't think in your head, because you see it the way it last left as a baby, and I'm thinking of this snake as a baby, but this thing's got to be an adult now, and I haven't heard any issues with it. It's not regurgitating. It's not causing any problems. It has zero symptoms. Is the organism still there? Maybe. We don't know. But if it is, it's in an active state. And if it's not shedding cysts, and we don't see that in the microscope, chances are, it's not contagious either. It's effectively, and that's been the big dilemma we've had, is how do you find it? Is it gone once it's gone, or can it come back and reactivate if it's still there? And that's been the $1 million question.
That is the $1 million question. And in the academic veterinary world, if you read the literature, that's what's referred to as an asymptomatic animal. And what all the information from necropsies and some of the publications show is that when an animal sheds the spores, and right after this, we can segue to the whole thing about the Scarlet letter, your collection has crypto conversation, because this is a good segue, is that the animals basically become asymptomatic. They have the organism in the gut. It's living in there. That's been shown that it's extremely difficult to clear this thing from the entire gastrointestinal tract. But these adult animals seem to be, they go through periods of being symptomatic, and then they go asymptomatic, and then they go symptomatic, and then they go asymptomatic. And the major driver, surprise, surprise, is stress. So if they become physiologically stressed, their immune system drops. Something in that immune system is what's keeping the crypto at bay and keeping it from reproducing both asexually and sexually. And then when they start doing that, the reproduction piece, that's when they start shedding the spores, and you start to see the funky poops, the smelly poops, the liquid poops, and the lumen of the stomach thickens up, which leads to the regurgitation. So what I've come to the conclusion with all of this stuff, and this is me, not the veterinarian, listen to the veterinarian, but I've spoken with some veterinarians, and they've said the same thing, is that when these animals become asymptomatic, that's when the ethical question comes into play, because you know the animal has the spores. There's the possibility that they are shedding spores. But for all intents and purposes, you have a snake at this point that is functioning, that individual is functioning as a normal, healthy snake. So what do you do with it? And there's some people that are on the very extreme side of things, which say, it's got crypto, we need to euthanize it because we don't want the possibility of crypto popping up in our collections. There's other people that have the stance of, well, it's asymptomatic. It probably is shedding some spores, but the spore load is so low that it may not be leading to infections. So, we treat it, we mitigate the stress, we keep it safe. We always say it has crypto, but it's probably not a huge detriment to the collection. But ethically, what do you do? What do you say? Is crypto worth a scarlet letter? I'm going to flat out say my opinion, maybe not the opinion of the podcast. My opinion is it's not a scarlet letter. I don't think it's right to, whisper. One of the things is when I started going on podcasts talking about crypto, you would be amazed at how many people messaged me and said, this guy's got crypto. That guy has crypto. This gal has crypto. This person breeds crypto. And then, the reality of that is I don't think 90% of Colubrid keepers know that there's crypto right now in their collection. Because everything that I've seen is when we start randomly testing these animals, crypto pops up far more often than it doesn't. And the reason why is if you look at the data, these animals are asymptomatic is basically what's going on, because their care is such that they've reached adulthood. They probably picked crypto up at some point through their life history to that point, and their care is good. So if their care is good, they're not being stressed. If they're not being stressed, the disease isn't manifesting itself. And I just want you to think about these animals like on Morph Market and Fauna, and you go to the reptile show. How many people have them before they ultimately end up, unless you take them straight out of the egg? And they're bouncing between these collections, and each collection, we haven't said it yet, but one of the things that just sucks about this particular organism is the number of spores needed to cause an infection is ridiculously low. It's not high at all. And so they get exposed once or twice, there's a chance that you're going to get that spore in there. It's going to burrow into the gastrointestinal tract somewhere, and then it's there in a dormant state for the next 5, 10, 15 years of that animal's life. So I think that there needs to be a little bit of a paradigm shift when it comes to how we respond to crypto. So I've set it up.
And we don't
there
wanna,
you go.
We don't want to scare everybody as well, because the other thing is which we still haven't been able to disprove, is where did the crypto come from in the first place? Because, and that's one of the things we wanted to see. That was another thing we wanted to see is now I'm trying to bring very little into my collection, all out of egg for the sake of, and get them eating for the sake of this experiment, is that, is it going to return? Because it's actually in the wild and it's been there the whole time. Mm-hmm. Nobody's ever disproved that, and maybe it's only in certain states. Nobody's done the epidemiology on the flow of where it originally came from. Why is it so prevalent? Well, Florida flies are native to Florida. I don't know about where you are, but there's a lot of schmutz that's native to Florida. Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't be surprised that most of this stuff is just, we get the flies into our collections. They come in from outside, and eventually, there's a lizard out in your backyard that has it, that migrated over here, and it gave it to your snake. And we talk about lizard crypto and snake crypto. They're two distinct species, but lizard crypto infects snakes,
yes,
and snake crypto infects lizards. They're not really, one just generally has a preference and is more likely to kill your animal if it's that species, so we still use that general term, but there's been issues, I think, with hognoses.
Yes.
Has been the big hot key is they tend to actually get the other strain, the Varani, a lot more common. But even ball pythons can get it. They just don't get any. And they can succumb to it with poor husbandry as well. It's just they're a lot more resistant. That disease is not. Again, you're dealing with a different animal population, and so a lot of the vectors we also were blaming was the ball pythons, because everybody's got them, and they can potentially be asymptomatic because it just doesn't affect them the same way, and they might be shedding. So, I had the monoculture, which gave me a unique advantage to sort some things out. But most people that keep large collections don't keep monoculture. They keep a mixture of things, and then, that was one of the scary things we talked about was we're like, the Burmese pythons potentially brought in an Asian lungworm. And that's a problem because now we have a new pathogen that our native animals don't know how to deal with.
Yeah, the pets.
And there are native ones to Florida. And I picked up the story behind that was I had given to me a wild corn snake with diarrhea. Figure it out. And I ran a fecal on that, and I actually brought it to my professor who deals with mostly the human stuff, and she had never seen it before, and neither had I, and it turned out to be this. You can't tell the species apart in the microscope, but it was hands down a pentastome, which is essentially a parasitic crustacean. Think of a killer shrimp that gets in your lung and then slowly kills you. And you actually have to go into their lungs and manually remove these things. And they are fecal orally transmitted. So if I was handling that animal, and it's not, as long as you wash your hands and you're being careful, you can avoid these things. But it's not a perfect system because it's very infectious, and you can become infected with that. Actually, it's in areas where they eat raw snake in some of these Asian countries. That's where all the case studies are from. They were getting these pentastomes. It's zoonotic, and that just freaked me out. And as much as I love that kind of stuff, once I get to zoonotics and I am in my own home and not in the laboratory with my hood and all my abilities to keep things sterile like that, it really freaks you out because you've removed all the controls and now you're putting yourself at risk. So research needs to be done in a lab, and that's why we're mostly migrating the research over to you now because I just don't have the space to do it the way I want to do it or the people to do it either. So it's you have a lot more hands-on and, that one experiment I tried to do last year while I had the animals gone didn't work out because of I was so clean that I couldn't get flies. I couldn't get snakes to infect other snakes. So there's actually the hopeful part that comes out of that is when you try to get flies to infect your other snakes and prove that it's a vector. I did, and I had all the controls and everything, and I just couldn't get the flies to get into that room. I was just so clean that the flies, I just couldn't attract them, and they never came in the room, and I could never get them to test positive. And then one day, it's Florida, so we don't usually pay much to the temperature at this time of year, actually further into the fall. And then all of a sudden we had our first cold snap. And all of my corn snakes that I had bred for that experiment, which your students were supposed to be doing, but I think, you lost your room or something, and I ended up taking over the project. And I said, this is a bad idea because I got a lot of work to do. And sure enough, I wasn't paying attention, and it dropped over 10 degrees in that room. And if you know anything about baby corn snakes and temperature shocks like that, and I had just fed them, well, they didn't hold down their meal, and now I've got the regurg problem, and these animals are already thin, And so I threw them into brumation to try to rescue them. And then my wine cooler went out.
Yeah, and they cooked them.
My wine cooler went out, and then I lost most of the animals. I'm like, well, I guess that's it.
So Jen, just because we want to make sure that well, not only that, but I also want to pinpoint a couple of like key targets here.
Yeah.
So, what would you recommend keepers do preventatively in their collection as mitigation, but also proper cleanliness, just to be cautious of, but also, preemptively thinking? My thought has always been, you prepare for the worst. By preparing for the worst, you are cautious and over-structured. So, what would be your recommendations? I mean, do you think like catchy fly traps are helpful? Do you think?
Well, they definitely are.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I've been able to keep the flies down drastically, and again, this is going to be Florida king snakes can handle this, but a lot of species won't be able to, is working on dryness. Just those flies don't do well without the humidity. And so everything's in air conditioning right now. And I noticed that I can actually keep them out pretty well by, making sure my substrate stays dry, which means you've got to make sure they stay hydrated with lots of water. So king snakes can handle that. They can handle it being very dry and just seeking out water. And they'll hang out in their water bowls all day when you do that. And that's just as an experiment, it worked. I don't have flies everywhere right now, and I've got over 100 babies here still, but there's not zero, but it's not it's not a level of concern where I'm worried about it spreading disease either, because the titers are just that low. And of course, with the babies in mind, everyone's like, the few people, mostly I've been trying to. It is a taboo subject, but mostly I've kept it quiet just because of for those of you who don't know, when you're in research, people can scoop your work and they can publish before you. And that's a big thing for Zach over here, who's trying to get his students published. That's a big part of that. And so we have to keep quiet so people don't steal our data. But, it's not, and then we don't want people to say he said, she said. One of the things that I learned from some expert breeders is just you can keep the flies out of smaller containers with pantyhose. And I know that sounds ridiculous. So instead of buying pantyhose, I bought something similar to that. But you can actually, so what I'll say to that is, yes, you can keep animals in a collection squeaky clean with these, I call them fly condoms, and you can do that. But the amount of extra work you have to do to keep that on and clip them and all that stuff, it's a lot of work. And, it's not something I want to do every year. But it's something that, everybody said, how are you going to do what you do without, potentially risking the other animals that you're selling to people? And I said, well, let's use what we know. And nobody's gotten anything that's come back positive but the level of work involved, it's just, it's a lot of work. So, you got to understand how much work breeders already put in. And it just got to the point with working this new job and with humans and my teaching job and this, I just can't maintain a collection that size and do that kind of thing anymore. So that's why when Zach found, Zach was kind of enticing me, and that's how he got the bulk of the main collection, the adults. And so, we agreed that it would be better if we continued the research over there and in the university where we can have proper quarantine rooms, because ideally you can seal off a room and make it so that you can even work on airflow. It's how much time and effort do you want to put into it, because you can do it. I've proven you can do it with certainty, but the amount of work, the extra work you have to do is astronomical. I mean, you're increasing your workload by at least 3 times. So if you're already working 40 hours a week as a breeder, and then you add this extra step onto there, it's, you're better off getting another room somewhere that you can isolate off and keep the flies from getting in if you can.
Very cool.
So it's not, and it's not just crypto you have to be worried about. That's just the one that we were talking about because of the big mystery, and that's the research we were focusing on. But there's so many other organisms that infect, and some of them are commensals and some are opportunists.
Yeah, I can actually speak to that real quick. So when we were, great example is that crypto is a boogeyman, and people need a boogeyman. They need something to blame things on. And when we were nearing the end of our big outbreak, which we have completely gotten under control at the university and all that, and we had basically set up, part of our protocol was that any animal that showed any sign of cryptosporidiosis, we were going to euthanize at that point. This is before we got to where I am currently. This is the whole thing with science, is you learn and change and learn and change and so on. So we had some animals that showed evidence of having cryptosporidiosis. So we took them to the vet and they were euthanized. And one of those animals was a all right, Matt, I need your help. Oreocryptophis porphyracia laticinctus.
Porphyracia, correct.
Laticinctus is which one? The broad-banded bamboo rat snake. I think that's right. And so they regurged and died. And so we sent all these animals totally expecting, we sent them to the University of Georgia, and we had them do the necropsies that they do and the full pathology. They made slides. I mean, it was expensive. And here we thought all those animals had crypto based off all the diagnoses we have learned. None of them had crypto. Every single one of them had died from something else. And what was really interesting is that most of them had actually died from fungal infections in their lungs, because when I went back and actually looked at the way we were housing them at the time, they were not ventilated anywhere near as much as they needed to be. And subsequent to getting those results, we ventilate the hell out of everything now. But it just goes to show that think, get the samples, talk to your vet, and send things away before you make the call, it's crypto, and kill everything. Because here I am, all that knowledge, and I was dead wrong. I was completely wrong with the diagnosis.
And I wouldn't just kill everything anyway, because for one, it takes a while to even see symptoms. So that the preliminary cornstick, the 2 cornstick experiment, it took 6 weeks from putting these hatchling animals that we knew they had to be clean because they came right out of the egg, and we know crypto can't transmit that way. So we put them in there, and it took 6 weeks before they started showing symptoms. And they died from emaciation. They didn't just drop dead. They never do. They will live as long as you keep them hydrated and until they run out of fuel, kind of like the Saturnidae moths. They just keep going until they run out of fat to live off of. So, so the fact that it's already in your collection, one of the things we were discussing is it's probably better to just, if you have the flies and you can't manage to keep them down, is to one, check the flies to see if they're actually, if it's there, because chances are the rest of your collection has been exposed to it, and they may just be silently harboring it. So yeah, you killed these 10 animals, but the other 50 you have it there, and you won't see it for another year, maybe 5 years, because when your husbandry is good, snakes have an immune system, and you don't tend to see it. And so what a lot of the blame and pointing goes is, there's a lot of breeders that probably have it in their collection, and they go to ship it, and now that particular stress seems to bring it out.
Yes.
And now that animal is there, and then a couple weeks later after they receive it, it starts regurgitating, and the breeder's like, okay, I tested my collection and everything is negative. I tested 5 random animals in my collection and it's all negative. And the breeder's not lying about that. It really is negative. It's that those animals weren't stressed out, and it's not there. It's not expressing, and it's not currently infecting anything. And so that can happen where you have animals. Somebody buys an adult animal from somebody, and you shipped it, and now that animal starts showing symptoms, but no one can pull a positive in the collection. So this is why they call it's cryptic, because you would think, okay, if I have it, it had to come from the guy I got it from, and it was, but not if they can't detect it. So sitting there demanding that breeder go and then of course they're going to check their stuff. And at one point I had a guy got something from me, and I think he got it from the ball pythons he had. I had a completely different strain of crypto. I had the lizard one, and in a random search, and I was like, none of these things have any symptoms, and it's not even the right species. Yeah. So, it was like, where did he get it from? And I couldn't pull a positive on there at all on that species. So it's really hard to say. And my animals were pretty stressed out at that time from some kind of heat wave I had. So, the fact that I was even able to pull a positive off a different species, I'm sure we can start finding the tortoise and snakes too. We'll probably find everything if we look for it.
Yep. And
that's the big difference, is whether you're looking for it or not. I've seen plenty of collections with random regurges and this and that. We don't know what that is. And it's not necessarily crypto either. Regurg is a symptom of just about everything. And I've only had, I think, 2 of them ever bloated. So if you see the bloat, you can breathe. That's the only sign that, it's crypto. But most of the animals that I've interacted with other people's collections and my own, when I was dealing with that, is they don't do the bloat. They regurge, or they'll refuse to eat, and they'll just outright refuse to eat.
Yep.
But they don't actually do the bloat thing necessarily. So it's one of those, that's the hallmark of it. But when the majority of them don't express that symptom, you can't just rely on that as your indicator. You do need to get it tested. And it's everywhere. And many famous breeders. And that's why we don't want to sit there and start demonizing it, because you've probably been living with it the whole time, and you've had it the whole time, and those breeders had it the whole time. But if it really is a wild parasite and we keep reintroducing it, we've managed to figure out, we didn't know what it was, and it was there, and we've managed to keep collections of animals. We don't have to euthanize them all. We need to work on our husbandry skills.
100%.
Because if it's really there, and this is the true test, everything I have is captive bred at this point here. And if it comes back, because I don't bring anything else in that's not out of egg, and it comes back, we're going to have to start checking the environment and seeing if that's what's going on. Because how I'm going to sterilize everything, I'm going to end up with white hands at the end of it.
There you go.
Right? So we have that opportunity, because, we really don't know. And all my stuff was testing negative, and that was the issue. So you have a collection full of negative testing snakes, and I can't prove anything one way or the other that were isolated from that other population. But we don't know.
And that is why, when you get your animals, it is important to put them in a quarantine, because the stress of the shipping is what's going to cause them to express the disease. And as long as you've got them in a separate place with walls and doors, like, quarantine is not the other side of the snake room. It's like another floor of the house, or even a completely different building.
Your COVID's 6 feet away.
Yeah. and there we go. So we don't have time to hit the next parasite, Strongyloides, on this one, but we'll have to have you back on again, Jen.
Yeah, we can do a little bit about. I'm not the world expert on it. It was just something that I passed off to you because I didn't feel like dealing with it.
We will, because we will hit that one in a future episode for sure, because that's kind of the other end of the spectrum. That one that one's just gross. Not that crypto's not gross.
I just wish we had a veterinary manual that told you how to deal with it, because they do, and then you follow their protocol and it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Not that you guys, again, you go to a veterinarian. That's where I get to use my letters and say, I get to do this because it's an experiment, but don't experiment on your own animals if you love your animals, right? So please always go to the vet if if you want to do some experiments with your vet under your vet's supervision. That's great. We can use that data.
So if people want to find you and talk crypto, talk Florida King snakes, where do they go to find you?
I'm going to do what I can right now with my current situation. You can just, I guess, hit me up on Facebook Messenger. Everyone knows who I am, and I will get to you eventually, but I can't promise you. With I've got to take care of my own students and everything.
Yeah, you're busy just like Matt and I.
Yeah, we're workaholics, and that's what we are. And I'm really glad we're finally going to get to pass on the baton and have your students doing all the work, because as you see, I can't do an experiment while trying to juggle 60 other things without screwing it up with the temperature.
Yeah.
I'm used to E. coli. If I fry it, it's not a big deal. I just grow some more. I don't have to wait another year to hatch out another 12 snakes to sit there and use it with the control population, and then all these odds and ends that go wrong that had nothing to do with your experiment.
Yep.
So hopefully we'll get some better data out of there, and we'll be able to resolve this problem once and for all with the outdoors and everything.
Yep. All righty. Well, this has been great.
Awesome.
Thanks for coming on. We've truly enjoyed this conversation. So, Matt, if people want to find you, where do they go to find you?
Sarpamitra on Facebook or Sarpamitra USA on Instagram.
Okay. And as always, we thank the NPR Network for being willing to have a Colubrid show. We are proud to be members of that network, and we plan on being here, hopefully, for quite some time. People that want to get a hold of me, you can find me on Instagram, Dr. Crawdad there, because my day job, I'm an astacologist, crayfish biologist. And if on Facebook, Zach Loafman, that's where you can find me. So this has been another episode of Colubrid and Colubroid Radio. Thank you all for listening. Have a good one.